that the U.S. is taking resources away from the Middle East or from Europe and deploying them to Asia. Apparently, they don't want to give that impression. They just want to give the impression that, yes, they are paying sufficient attention to Asia as it deserves. And so with the U.S. Announcements of increasing military cooperation and deployment even of some troops in Australia, and also with the Philippines and with Singapore, I think that there are signs of U.S. re-engagement with Asia. The Japanese reaction to this, being in Tokyo, is overall, I think, to welcome the U.S. engagement because of the reasons I cited before, but some concern that perhaps Japan's role is diminishing, in the sense that the following: there are many people in Japan who are concerned that the U.S. presence in Okinawa is so intense and there's so many troops there, and they want the troops to be reduced and, say, moved to Guam or other places. At the same time, they don't want Japan's role as an ally of the United States to be diminished. And so it's kind of a dilemma, because on the one hand, they want to be a close ally of the United States, but the local circumstances in Okinawa in particular make it difficult for the U.S. and Japan to continue the intensity of the troop deployment there in Okinawa. But I think that increasingly many people in Japan are of the view that Japan has been playing too passive a role with regard to the U.S. and East Asia, and that Japan needs to take more of an initiative. And as one manifestation of this, I think, is the renewed attention to FTAs, EPAs, EIAs, and the TPP, free trade agreements, economic partnership agreements, and economic integration agreements, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So these are kind of the schemes. The Japan-EU, it was originally called an FTA, but then it's kind of morphed into, I guess, an EIA. It's very interesting because now Japan is much more interested than the EU in entering into this negotiation. The reason being that there are some in Europe, and especially in the auto industry, who believe that an FTA or even an EIA or EPA would focus primarily on tariffs, reduction of tariffs, but that in the view of the EU, at least the auto industry, the problems of getting into Japan are not tariffs, they're non-tariff barriers. And therefore their view is if the tariffs in the two regions are reduced as a result of the agreement, that will benefit Japan much more than it will benefit the EU. So that's the view which has led to reluctance on the part of some in the EU to engage in these negotiations. I think things are progressing, and eventually I think there will be full-scale negotiations on this. But Japan is very concerned in part because Korea has already reached an FTA agreement with the EU, and as a result, automobiles and electronics products from Korea are going to be advantaged in their price because of the reduction of tariffs in the EU market. In the middle is the China, Japan, Korea, and ASEAN++. And on the left below is the ASEAN +1. And then on the right is the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. And then eventually, all of this is supposed to roll into the free trade agreement of Asia-Pacific, which would include all the APEC countries. So this is a busy chart, but it shows the ongoing EPA, FTA negotiations that Japan is involved in. Now you'll see that there have been 12 countries in one region where it's been concluded, but you notice that, not to be derogatory, but they're not huge economies. Singapore, Mexico, Malaysia, Chile, Thailand, Indonesia, Brunei, ASEAN, Philippines, Switzerland, Vietnam, India, Peru. I mean, these are probably the easier countries for Japan, in part because they don't export a lot of agriculture. Under negotiation, there are Australia, GCC, South Korea, Mongolia, Canada. Now, Australia and Canada are seriously underway right now. I think South Korea is now re-engaging again, although it went on for a number of years, stopped, and now it's re-engaging. And then under study discussion are, in fact, just I think a few days ago there was a meeting of the trade ministers of Japan, China, and South Korea in Beijing, just a few days, just as I was leaving Japan. And I think the hope was to start officially these negotiations for free trade area of these three countries by the end of this year. So there's a lot of activities, but I think all of this is being motivated by what I'll explain later as an attempt by the people in Japan who are interested in Japan globalizing versus those in Japan who are having a much more kind of inward-looking view. So this is, again, kind of a rehash of what I've said before. Now, just take note on the TPP, on the top, it says November 11th, okay? It says conference by Prime Minister Noda. I have decided to enter into consultations toward participating in the TPP negotiations with the countries concerned. So very careful choice of words. He's not saying that he has decided to participate. He enter into consultations toward participating. It's a very important distinction given the opposition among some in Japan to Japan's participation in the TPP. And this is kind of the road to FTAP, this all-encompassing, the APEC countries all rolling into a free trade agreement. So just within the last few years, I think some recent developments. One is Japan has had 13 prime ministers in 20 years, 6 prime ministers in the last 6 years. There are some parallels drawn between the United States and Japan in terms of political deadlock, but at least one thing about the United States is that there's a clear schedule. Presidential elections every 4 years, congressional elections every 2 years. The thing that's really unsettling about Japan is that under the parliamentary system, there can be a no confidence vote in the Diet, or the prime minister can decide to dissolve the Diet at any time, so nobody knows when the next election could be. And so there's a great deal of uncertainty among political leaders, obviously, but also business leaders, journalists, and others about when is the next election going to be. For instance, this coming September, there will be an election for the head of the Democratic Party of Japan and the head of the LDP, but there are some who expect that there may be a general election before the end of this year. But then there's others predicting, there's about, I think, 5 or 6 scenarios that the pundits and the specialists on Japanese politics have portrayed about the future of the politics of the next several months. So although I think it's not accurate to say that Japan is unstable, I think it's very stable, despite the change in the prime ministership. However, when it comes to major decisions, it does take political leadership, such as like raising the consumption tax, which is the biggest single issue being debated right now in Japan. The other interesting thing is that the LDP was voted out of office in 2009, I think more because of the dissatisfaction with the LDP rather than the firm knowledge that the Democratic Party would do a better job. There was an expectation and hope that the Democratic Party would do a better job, and many of those people have been disappointed. So the most recent public opinion polls show that the support for the LDP and the support for the DPJ each is less than 20%, which means that more than 60% of the voters who are unhappy with the current group, the two parties. And so there's this kind of growing sense of populism, and the most talked about and the most telegenic and the most invited person in Japan to appear on TV these days on political issues is Mr. Toru Hashimoto, who used to be the governor of Osaka, is now the mayor of Osaka. He's a lawyer by background, in his 50s, very articulate, very good debater. Nobody knows exactly what he stands for, but he's tremendously popular because he says things that he sounds very decisive, and which is lacking when it comes to the leadership of the DPJ and the LDP. There is, I think, a growing sense of anxiety of gradual economic decline in Japan, but it's not the kind of crisis that, for instance, South Korea felt in 1997-98. I think many people argue that South Korea has been able to revive itself economically in part because they're up against the wall, they had to rely on the IMF to bail them out, and they really had to get serious and reform themselves. Japan is, in many ways, too comfortable yet. So just as in the post-war period, there was what many people in Japan said was the kokunaiha versus the kokusaiha. Those were kind of domestic types versus the internationalists. Now I think there's what I labeled the uchumukiha, those who are inward-looking, and the gurobaruha or gurobarukaha, those who are more outward-looking. And TPP, in my mind, is a prime example of this phenomenon, of this debate within Japan between those who are globalists and those who are very domestically oriented. So this is TPP. I don't have enough time to go. I think I only have about 5 minutes left. So let me just tell you briefly about the TPP. On October 1, 2010, when Prime Minister Kan was the Prime Minister, he said in a Diet address that he was in favor of the TPP. Now, this caught a lot of people by surprise because he had not really consulted with many people, either in government or outside of government. So everybody in Japan said, what is the TPP? So in typical fashion in Japan, all the newspapers, all the magazines, all the TV stations had a quick seminar on the TPP. By the end of the week, everybody in Japan, including the taxi driver, knew what the TPP was. So then you had Japanese Diet members going to Washington, and many of them came to me and said, look, we went to Capitol Hill to talk about TPP. Nobody in Washington has heard about TPP. And it's true. At that time, this is about a year ago. So I think what happened was that because the Prime Minister made the announcement of his support without really consulting with the various constituencies involved, and people were kind of confused and trying to figure out what this is all about, it gave time for the opponents, the Japan agriculture interests in particular, to rally their forces. And they were very smart in trying to get others in the Japan Medical Association, lawyers, accountants, all kinds of other professions to go to them to say, your profession is going to be wiped out if the TPP is signed between the US and Japan, because the US is coming with the black ships, the Commodore Perry black ships, as in the 1800s, to open Japan and to totally redo Japan, change Japanese culture, and to be like the United States. And this PR campaign actually was quite effective. And if you go to a bookstore in Tokyo and probably find 30 books on the TPP, the vast majority of them are anti-TPP. Most of the people who write these books don't know what they're talking about, but I was in Washington, D.C. in October of 2011 attending a conference of the U.S.-Japan Council, which I'm on the board of, and I talked with a number of people in Washington about the TPP. There were very mixed views in the U.S. about their desire to have Japan involved. I think some people in Congress and some in USTR, the negotiators, were concerned that if Japan joined at this late date, that it could dilute the quality of the TPP, because the stated goal of the TPP is to have a high-quality 21st century trade agreement that addresses not only tariffs, but also intellectual property rights and many other non-tariff issues. Also, I think there were some who were concerned that it might drag things out, take more time. Also, there were some in Congress, especially from Michigan, who, representing their constituents, did not want the US and Japan to enter into TPP negotiations because, in parallel with the EU example, the auto industry, some auto industry executives and others in the United States and labor unions believe that a TPP would benefit Japan more than the United States, because if it focuses primarily on tariffs. State Department, on the other hand, and I think the White House as well, they were in favor of Japan and are in favor of Japan entering TPP, partly because it gives the TPP greater coverage and more significance, also because it strengthens the US-Japan economic relationship, but potentially the political relationship as well. And also, I think by having Japan in, I think it will, from the US State Department point of view, get Japan and the US on the same sheet of paper, trying to set certain rules that the Chinese will hopefully in the future have to adhere to if they want to join the TPP. So Prime Minister Noda, as a few minutes ago I mentioned, announced on November 11th his decision to enter into consultations with the view of participating in the TPP. The interesting thing is that the reaction in the Japanese media, when it was announced that Prime Minister Noda had announced his interest, NHK, like the BBC of Japan, the announcer said, the Prime Minister has agreed to consider entering these negotiations, and this is to help President Obama's re-election. And so it's really hard for me to figure this one out. Well, they explained that the president had pledged that he would double American exports in 5 years. And in order to accomplish this goal, according to the NHK, the president needs to have Japan in the TPP to give it greater coverage. And therefore, as a campaign pledge, he needs to have Japan's participation. So he desperately wants Japan in the TPP, and Prime Minister Noda is helping him, and therefore he is helping the president get reelected, which is very strange. It's an argument I've never heard in Washington. But I think it shows how huge the gap in perception is between Washington and Tokyo. Also in the LDP, there are many people in the LDP, Liberal Democratic Party, the opposition party, who are in support of the TPP, but they will not say it publicly because they want to use it as a vehicle to criticize the Prime Minister and the DPJ. And in fact, Tanigaki, Mr. Tanigaki, the head of the LDP, publicly said, why are you, Prime Minister Noda, helping President Obama's re-election campaign by agreeing to the TPP? Which again, I think is science fiction, but it's incredible that in this day and age that there would be such a huge perception between the US and Japan. I won't talk about Mr. Yamada because it'll take too much time. Priority right now in Japan in terms of economic issues is the consumption tax. And no one knows how long the Prime Minister will be in office, but I think that the Prime Minister's leadership has been important in Japan's leaning favorably towards TPP. So the future of the TPP, I think, will depend in part on who the Prime Minister is. And if it's Prime Minister Noda or if it's someone who supports TPP, I think it'll go forward. If not, Japan may not decide to go ahead. But to my view, this is a kind of example of this insular versus global view. I see I'm running out of time, so I guess I'm going to have to skip some of this stuff. Although, except to say that I would point out this Japanese students in the US, 1997, 47,000, 2010, 21,000. Foreign students at Harvard, Drew Faust, Harvard president, came to Japan 2 years ago and said, in the last 10 years, the students from China studying at Harvard increased from 227 to 463. Students from Korea, South Korea, 183 to 315. Students from Japan, 151 to 101. And the only country among the top 10 countries sending students to Harvard where the numbers have declined. So I mean, I won't go into detail on this. But it's, I have a real concern about the insularity that one finds in Japan. We can talk about this during the reception since I don't have enough time. There is, I think, however, bifurcation. There are some Japanese youth who spend a lot of time abroad and who are quite fluent in foreign languages, use Twitter, Facebook, and so forth. But then there's a huge population who are very inward-looking and very domestically oriented. I think it has some long-term negative implications for Japan in terms of Japan's involvement in the global community and contribution to global institutions and organizations. And given the competitive environment Japan is, not only BRICS and Asian countries, but looking at the Singapore Economic Development Board and looking at the efforts by Bavaria and other German states to attract foreign direct investment, and especially after March 11th, with the impact it had on tourism to Japan, the global industrial supply chain, exports to Japan, foreign direct investment to Japan, energy supply, all of these are factors that are not in Japan's favor. So let me draw to a conclusion here. So the U.S.-East Asian relations, as I've tried to explain, are in flux, and these are partly a result of regional dynamics within the East Asian region, partly a result of domestic factors in Japan and the United States. The relationships, I think, probably until 20 years ago, one could characterize as primarily the U.S. in Asia as bilateral relationships with Japan, with China, with South Korea, and so forth. But now, increasingly, I think the U.S. involvement in Asia, East Asia, is becoming multilateral and complex. I believe it's crucial for the U.S. to stay engaged in Asia because of the economic growth, but also because of the political and security importance of Asia. I also think it's important to rely on area expertise. There's a tremendous amount of complications, complexities in Asia. I mean, there are some parallels drawn between Asia and, say, EU, but even more than the EU, the Asian countries are diverse, and it requires a tremendous amount of local knowledge, language knowledge, culture, history to understand the complexities of each of these countries. I think the resources, funding as well as people in the US government and the Japanese government are increasingly limited given the budget deficits of both countries. And so I think the role of corporations, universities, mass media, social media, NGOs, NPOs, that is the non-government sector, is extremely important to make sure that the US stays engaged with East Asia and that the US and Japan work together, not only on bilateral and regional issues, but also on global issues. And so, as a fan of San Francisco, I really hope that the San Francisco Bay Area, especially because of the strong professions here, the corporations, including in Silicon Valley, the technology, the innovation, the diversity of people here, many from Asia, the universities, NGOs, NPOs, I really hope that the San Francisco Bay Area can play a key role in making sure that the US stays engaged in East Asia and that the US is smart in dealing with East Asia.